She only stopped for gas. A rundown motel on a forgotten back road, the kind of place no one booked on purpose. But when Claire Jensen noticed the metal hatch half buried under the cracked parking lot, something in her gut told her to pry it open. What she found below wasn't just rusted tunnels and echoes, it was a Cold War ghost no one was supposed to wake. Before we dive in, tell us where in the world you're watching from. We love hearing your stories. And if hidden bunkers, forgotten tech, and stories of grit and mystery are your thing, don't forget to subscribe. Because tomorrow's story, it might just go deeper than this one. The wipers gave out 5 miles back, but Claire kept driving. Her truck had seen better days maybe a decade ago, and now it groaned every time she shifted gears. Still, she coaxed it through the rain-slick back roads like it was muscle memory. Trees closed in on either side of the highway, thick with wet pine and that eerie stillness that only came when you were too far from town. Then the fuel light blinked. Again. She swore under her breath and scanned the road ahead. That's when the faded neon shape cut through the mist, a flickering sign that simply read, Motel, half-lit and slumped like it had given up on travelers years ago. The parking lot was cracked, moss pushing up through every seam, and the cars out front were frozen in time. A rusted Caprice, a teal pickup with mismatched doors, and an AMC Eagle with one tire missing. No movement, no people. Just the low groan of her truck coming to a reluctant halt in front of room 4. Claire killed the engine and stepped out into the silence. Her boots splashed into a shallow puddle. The air smelled like mildew and cold iron. She pulled her jacket tighter, grabbed her tool bag from the passenger seat, and eyed the building. The windows were dark and broken in places. Curtains fluttered in rooms no one had entered in years. Still, something tugged at her curiosity. Not fear exactly, just that feeling she got when machines whispered to her. This place had a story. She could feel it. She walked toward the office. The glass door was cracked but unlocked. Inside, a layer of dust blanketed the front desk, where a yellowed ledger still sat open, pen dried mid-signature. Keys hung behind it, labeled with room numbers, each one rusted into place. Claire ran her fingers over the counter, then stepped back outside. No phone service, no vending machines. Not even a soda can rolling in the wind, just stillness. She circled the building once, mostly out of habit, scanning the lines of the roof, the back alley, the trash bins that hadn't been emptied since the Bush administration. That's when she noticed it. About 30 feet from the building, half buried in the cracked asphalt of the parking lot, was a square of metal. Not a drain, not a manhole, flat, industrial, with bold lettering carved deep into the plate. U.S.S.R. Air, Fosse, Subterranean, Ack Tunnel, 07. The spelling was off, Airfosse, and Subterranean, like someone had tried to engrave it in a hurry or with poor translation. But the metal was real, heavy, military grade. A strange wheel lock in the center looked like it hadn't moved in decades. Claire crouched beside it, tracing the edge with a gloved finger. The motel might have been dead, but this hatch was still holding on. She stood slowly, eyes scanning the woods around her. No sound, no watchers, just her and that sealed door in the ground. Whatever was down there, it hadn't seen daylight in a very long time. Claire didn't touch it at first. Just stood there, boots planted at the edge of the hatch, rain misting down soft as breath. The sun hadn't fully broken through the trees yet, and the motel behind her felt like a movie set all color drained, all life gone. But this was real. Thick steel, bolted edges, government markings. It was buried just deep enough to suggest effort. Not enough to hide, just enough to forget. She dropped to one knee and ran her hand along the cold surface. It wasn't rusted shut like she expected. Pitted, yes. Worn from decades of weather and neglect. But the hinges were still firm, barely oxidized. And that center wheel thick, grooved, and marked with directional arrows, looked like it could still turn, if someone really tried. Claire knew heavy-duty closures when she saw them. This wasn't your average utility lid. She grabbed her flashlight from her belt and clicked it on. No obvious seams, no recent wear, no footprints or drag marks. If anyone had been here, it hadn't been recently. She stepped back, scanning the area. The surrounding pavement was cracked in every direction, the motel's parking stripes long faded. But the ground around the hatch? Smooth, as if it hadn't shifted like the rest of the lot, like the earth beneath it was reinforced. She knelt again, leaning into her instincts now. Raised bolts, counterweight hinges. Claire had cracked open retired missile pods in scrapyards before nothing classified, just surplus junk from bases sold off in the 90 seconds. But even those had signatures, tells. This felt different. Purpose, built, but quiet about it. Cold War era, maybe, hidden in plain sight. A nearby pry bar caught her eye sticking out of the bed of a rotted-out pickup with no tires. She grabbed it and returned to the hatch. Wedged it beneath the lip, felt the resistance push back. It didn't give, not at first. She pressed harder, gritted her teeth. The bar groaned. Something cracked loose with a muted clunk, and the edge lifted just enough to release a breath of air, stale, warm, and dry, like the inside of a vacuum-sealed crate. Claire froze. She stood, nostrils flaring slightly. The motel was still silent behind her. The air that escaped hadn't smelled of rot or decay, just dust, old metal, and something faintly chemical, like oxidized oil or pressurized freon. Not recent, not dangerous, just old. She crouched again and gave the center wheel a tug. It didn't budge. She adjusted her grip, braced her foot against the hatch's frame, and twisted. Metal screamed. The wheel shifted half an inch, then caught, then spun the rest of the way with a heavy click-click-click. A deep locking mechanism disengaged underneath. And then, silence. Claire stood over the now unlatched hatch, hand hovering above the handle. She was no stranger to crawling into places she didn't belong. But this? This wasn't salvage. This was buried on purpose. Claire didn't hesitate this time. She'd opened enough sealed hoods and jammed gearboxes to know that curiosity wasn't something you ignored. Not when it pulsed like a heartbeat in your ribs. She took a breath, grabbed the handle embedded into the hatch, and pulled. It didn't open gracefully. The metal screeched against the frame, resisting every inch. Years of dirt and corrosion clung to the edges like stubborn secrets. But Claire gritted her teeth and kept pulling. Her gloves strained against the grip, arms shaking from the torque. With one last tug, the hatch slammed back against its hinges, revealing a square black hole beneath her boots. She exhaled hard. The smell hit her first dry, mechanical, still. Not the rot of animals or mildew, just stale air that hadn't been disturbed in decades, like the scent of an old radio pulled from a box in an attic. Wires and dust and time. Claire shined her flashlight into the opening. A steel ladder descended into darkness, bolted into one side of a reinforced shaft. The walls were smooth and gunmetal gray, welded in clean lines, not poured concrete. This wasn't a bunker for shelter. It was something else tighter, more controlled. She glanced up at the treetops, as if half expecting someone to appear, a siren, a drone, a warning. But the world was still quiet. The motel loomed behind her, forgotten and passive. The hatch groaned once more, adjusting to its new position. No alarms, no locks snapping shut. Whatever this was, no one was watching it anymore. Claire tucked her pry bar into her belt loop, clipped her flashlight to her jacket, and started climbing down. Each rung vibrated slightly under her weight. The air grew cooler the deeper she went. 15 feet, 20 the light above became a faint square, swallowed by gloom. Then her boots hit solid ground. She turned slowly. A short hallway stretched out in front of her, just wide enough for a person to walk single file. The floor was grated steel, echoing with each step. The walls were lined with pipes and conduit. some labeled in stenciled block letters: oxygen, coolant, comms, and on the far wall, a pressure door sealed tight, painted red and marked with one faded phrase: Sector 07 access. Cleared only. Claire stepped closer, running her fingers over the label. It flaked at her touch. A panel beside the door was dead. No lights, no power, but the mechanics were old school. Manual locks. She could work with that. Behind her, the shaft remained open. Above, the sky was a distant thought. Down here, time felt slower, heavier. She looked back at the door, reached for her tools. She wasn't just looking at a forgotten hallway. She was staring into something someone built to be sealed. Not broken, not discovered, buried. Claire worked in silence, her breath a soft rhythm in the stale air. The pressure door didn't give easily 3 mechanical latches, each locked with the kind of turn resistance that only years of disuse could produce. She pressed her weight into the last wheel, letting it groan, slowly forcing it counterclockwise until it gave a low, satisfying clunk. Then, the entire door shuddered and unsealed with a hiss. She stepped through. The hallway on the other side was wider, reinforced with steel ribbing every 10 feet, like the skeleton of a submarine buried underground. Dust covered everything, but not thickly, just a settled layer, undisturbed, soft as ash. Her boots left perfect prints behind her. She swept the beam of her flashlight slowly across the space. Signs in bold block letters marked the walls. Emergency escape. B. 120 meters. Reactor subcontrol. Clearance required. Living quarters. Unit A. The lettering was stenciled in English, but below it, in smaller type, were translations in Cyrillic. Claire's breath caught. Russian? No, not Russian exactly. Soviet. This wasn't just a military site. It was a Cold War joint facility, or worse, a hidden U.S. project modeled after Soviet counterparts. A decoy, a mirror, a leftover from an era when paranoia was a currency. She passed an open junction box on the wall. Inside, wires were bundled neatly, labeled with paper tags most yellowed, but still legible. Some systems ran deeper, others had been disconnected entirely. Her fingers brushed a conduit that hummed slightly beneath the dust. That stopped her. She crouched, placing her hand against the wall. Faint. Barely there. But power. Somewhere below, something was still drawing electricity. She straightened slowly, scanning the corridor. Ahead, the hallway split into 3 paths, each marked with metal plaques. Claire chose the center marked only Main Ops and walked forward. The silence was surreal. No wind, no rodents. Not even the creak of settling metal, just her own footsteps echoing with eerie clarity. The door to Main Ops was open, but just barely wedged against warped flooring. She shoved it with her shoulder, stepping into a circular chamber lined with control panels and blinking indicator lights. Blinking. Her pulse kicked up. She moved to the nearest panel, brushing off the dust. The lights weren't rhythmic, more like pulses. A diagnostic sequence stuck in a loop. Half-lit buttons labeled with "Sysinit" and "Auth fail" blinked lazily, like the system had been trying to wake itself for decades, but never quite made it. Screens lined the far wall, some cracked, some whole. A few glowed faint green, flickering with schematics of the tunnel's branching paths, marked Sector 01 through 12, each ending in heavy blocks of unknown function. And at the center of the room, on a dusty table, sat a single switch, covered in a cracked plastic casing. A label etched into the panel beneath it read, "Test mode. Do not engage." Claire stepped closer. The light above the switch flickered once. Something in this place was still waiting. Claire didn't touch the switch. Not yet. But the room had already changed. The blinking lights, the low hum of dormant systems, this place wasn't just echoing the past. It was still breathing. Quietly. Reluctantly. Like an old machine unsure if it was safe to wake up. She leaned closer to the console beside the test mode panel, brushing years of dust off the controls. The buttons were analog firm, military-grade toggles, and push switches, most labeled in both English and Cyrillic. No digital screens, just old-school gauges, voltage readouts, and a thick red phone that hadn't rung in decades. Claire ran her fingers along the control board until she found a label that made her pause. Envir, aux, power, status, standby. Below it, a small rocker switch. She hesitated, then flipped it. For a second, nothing happened. Then a low thud echoed through the tunnel behind her, followed by the sound of compressors whining to life. Weak, sputtering, but real. Overhead, the hallway lights blinked once, twice, and then began to hum. One by one, fluorescent panels along the corridor flickered on, flooding the darkness with pale white light. Claire turned slowly in the center of the room, watching as dust motes danced in the sudden brightness. The transformation was uncanny. What had been a lifeless crypt was now something else entirely. Not alive, exactly, but aware. The facility was listening again. She returned to the console. The green diagnostic lights now pulsed in cleaner intervals. A few relays clicked in the walls. Somewhere deeper in the complex, a fan began spinning. She reached for the test mode switch, then stopped herself. Whatever this was, it was tied into something deeper, not just lights and air. Systems, doors, maybe weapons. Instead, she moved to one of the wall-mounted filing cabinets beside the console. It took a few firm tugs, but the drawer slid open with a metallic groan. Inside were dozens of paper files, plastic-bound manuals, and brittle memos dated between 1966 and 1982. She flipped through quickly. Project GOLIATH. Mechanical overview. Tunnel sealing procedures. Emergency protocol. Airbase 07. Maintenance logs. Unredacted. The last one made her pause. She opened it. Inside were handwritten entries. Names, times, check-ins. One caught her attention. Reinforcement wall installed access. Shaft sealed under Motel. Confirmed by Jensen, Reese K. Date: the 18th of July 1980. 1. Her hands went still. Jensen. Same last name. Same spelling. Claire's grandfather had worked military contracts in the 72nds and 82nds, but he never talked specifics, only that his last job ran too deep. She sat slowly in the nearest chair, the pages trembling in her hands. He'd been here. She wasn't just exploring some forgotten tunnel. She was walking into the last place he ever put his name on record. The lights above crackled once more. Another subsystem clicked to life somewhere deeper inside. Claire stood. She was no longer just a mechanic who found a strange hatch. Now she had a reason to keep going. The air shifted as Claire moved deeper into the facility. Every step down the corridor felt like she was walking further into a time capsule. Not dusty ruins, but a machine in hibernation. Pipes overhead still carried faint vibrations. Wall-mounted conduit blinked with diagnostic lights that shouldn't have lasted 40 years. She passed a cracked window looking into what had once been a break room chairs overturned, a half-drunk coffee cup fossilized in dust, and a pin-up calendar still open to September 1981. Everything frozen mid-breath. The silence was heavier here, but not dead. Claire turned a corner and found herself in front of a reinforced steel door marked Command and Control. Authorized entry only. The window was darkened, but not shattered. She reached for the handle and was surprised to find it unlocked. It groaned open with a reluctant squeal, revealing a two-tiered command center. The upper level was lined with more filing cabinets and wall screens. Below, a semicircle of consoles surrounded a central platform like a sunken theater or a war room from an old spy film. CRT monitors lined the desks, their curved glass surfaces reflecting the dim emergency lighting. Thick cables coiled beneath every station like sleeping snakes. In the center of the room stood something she hadn't expected, a pedestal. And on that pedestal, behind cracked acrylic casing, sat a control switch. It wasn't large. It wasn't dramatic. Just a toggle, capped in yellow plastic, with one instruction stamped beneath. Test mode. Do not engage. Claire stared at it for a long moment. This wasn't a power switch. It wasn't for lights or fans. This was something else. She stepped around the console and looked at the other labels. Sector status. Mech sysarm. Divided by safe. Launch override keyport. Secured. That last one made her shiver. Launch override? She found a binder beside the main station and flipped it open. Pages of procedure, all written in terse military language. One page outlined a series of steps required to initialize GOLIATH test sequence alpha. Claire froze on the page. She read it again. GOLIATH was never scrapped. It wasn't decommissioned. It was sealed. Not retired, contained. She moved to the back of the room and opened a side cabinet marked Beta Config. Inside were tapes. Actual reel-to-reel magnetic tapes, carefully labeled with technician initials and timestamps. She recognized one of the signatures. Jensen. R.K. Her grandfather again. She pulled the tape gently from its slot and held it in both hands. There was no question now he'd worked on whatever this place was. Maybe even helped build it. Maybe even helped bury it. Claire stared back at the switch in the center of the room. It hadn't been touched in decades, but the light above it? It was green, faint, flickering, but green, as if the facility was still waiting for someone. For her, for what came next. Claire sat cross-legged on the cold metal floor of the control room, surrounded by yellowed folders and brittle carbon copies. The musty smell of old paper filled the air, ink, dust, and the faint trace of mildew. Her gloves were off now. She needed to feel the weight of the documents. These weren't just reports, they were breadcrumbs. The first folder was marked Internal Memo, Level 3 Access, Airbase 07, and dated the 12th of March, 1979. Inside were briefings written in dense bureaucratic language, but one paragraph stood out. The motel structure will continue to serve as a decoy. Civilian access is to be discouraged through neglect. The hatch must remain sealed under the pretense of dereliction. No signage beyond fabricated Soviet engravings. Intent is plausible deniability in case of breach. Claire's eyes narrowed. They disguised the site to look like a Cold War relic, even down to the misspelled hatch engraving. The goal wasn't to protect it, it was to hide it in plain sight. She reached for another folder, this one thicker. It was stamped, Project GOLIATH, Status Updates, divided by redacted. Most of the first few pages were blacked out with heavy ink, but further in, a few key terms bled through. By Pedal Mobile Deployment Vehicle, Deep Earth Compatible Chassis, Piloted, and Remote Modes Supported. Field. Capable reactor test. Success. Claire's breath caught. This wasn't just a weapon. It was a machine built for terrain no tank could cross. Something designed to move through tunnels, mountains, cities. It wasn't built for defense. It was built for deployment into the places people thought were safe. And buried at the bottom of the folder was a photo. Faded, grainy, stamped with the date July 1981. In the photo, a massive steel chamber, walls lined with scaffolding, and at its center a towering machine, mid-construction. It had a humanoid frame, reinforced limbs, armor plating like a tank's hide, and long cables tethered to the ceiling. On the back of the photo, in handwriting, she recognized from birthday cards and old receipts. Almost ready. Just needs her core. R.K. Jensen. Her heart dropped into her stomach. It was him. Her grandfather hadn't just worked here. He'd helped build it. She leaned back against the console, eyes unfocused. So many nights spent wondering why he never talked about the war, about the classified jobs. Now it made sense. You don't talk about secrets this big, not if you want to sleep at night. One last file caught her attention. It had no markings, Just a plain folder, brittle and silent. She opened it. Inside, a hand-drawn map. The layout of the tunnels. Sectors 01 through 12. One of them circled in red. Sector 09. Reactor core. Next to it, in faded pencil. If they ever come back, this is what they'll need. Claire stood, the map clutched in her hand. She knew where she was going next. The map from the unmarked folder guided Claire through the winding tunnels like a secret trail, one drawn by someone who knew how deep the silence here went. Sector 09 was 2 levels beneath the command deck, accessible only by a narrow maintenance shaft tucked behind a wall panel that had to be pried open with a screwdriver and a whole lot of muscle. She descended into a lower corridor, where the walls changed no longer. Brushed steel or paneling, but reinforced plating with signs of stress, as if something massive had moved through here once. The ceiling curved tighter. The air grew colder. Every footstep echoed longer. At the end of the corridor was a heavy blast door, half opened, wedged on a rusted track. Red warning paint flaked off in strips. Claire ducked under it and stepped into the most enormous underground chamber she'd ever seen. The air was dead still. The walls rose 50 feet in every direction, a silo-sized vault of concrete and steel. Cables snaked like veins along the ceiling, and cranes hung frozen in place above scaffolding that looked as though it hadn't seen use since Reagan was in office. And at the center, waiting like a fossilized myth, stood the machine, Goliath. Claire exhaled. Her flashlight beam traced the silhouette, 2 massive legs anchored to a reinforced deck, a torso shaped like the belly of a bomber, thick mechanical arms ending in complex multi-tool appendages, and a sloped cockpit nested into the chest like a pilot's throne. It wasn't a robot. It wasn't a tank. It was both, and more. Panels on its arms bore the faint ghost of American insignias, faded stars, and unit tags worn to smudges. The paint job was patchy, only partially completed, like the builders had stopped mid-construction and walked away. She circled the perimeter, eyes wide. It wasn't just a concept. It was real, a functioning or once-functioning prototype, built underground, hidden. The rumors of Cold War superweapons had always sounded absurd to her, until now. On the far side of the hangar, she found the operator's bay. It was cluttered with tools, coils of thick power cable, and a small locker half open. Inside were coveralls, a helmet, and a pair of thick gloves. The name stitched across the collar, Jensen. She reached inside. Something metal shifted, a key. She pulled it out heavy, cold, military cut attached to a dog tag on a chain. She turned back toward the machine. GOLIATH towered above her, as still as the grave. But now that she was looking, she could see it the faintest green light, deep in the cockpit's control panel. Not blinking, not signaling. Just on. Claire stepped closer, heart thudding in her ears. Whatever this machine was built for, it was never meant to be found again. But someone had left the door open. Claire stood at the base of the machine, the key still warm in her palm. Her flashlight beam swept slowly up GOLIATH's armored frame. Dust clung to its plating like ancient skin. Every bolt, every seam, had the look of hand-built precision. This wasn't a mass-production model. It was a prototype, one of one, which made it both priceless and dangerous. She climbed the access stairs welded into the platform. They groaned under her weight, but held. As she ascended, the silence began to change, not louder, just layered. There was sound now, faint, distant, like a voice leaking through metal. Claire paused, turned her head. Nothing behind her. No one in the chamber. But as she pressed her ear to the cockpit hatch, the sound sharpened. A static hum. And under it clipped words. She slipped the Jensen key into the console slot beside the hatch. It clicked. With a hiss, the cockpit door cracked open an inch. Claire pulled it the rest of the way. Inside, it smelled like copper and ozone. The interior was tight, barely enough room for one pilot. Monitors flickered on the dash, low res, faintly glowing. Analog meters twitched to life. Gauges pulsed, and the voice became clear. Launch sequence. Suspended. Awaiting manual override. Pause. Suspended. Manual override required. Repeat. It was a loop. A hold command. One that had been echoing for decades, locked in stasis. Claire eased into the pilot seat. The cushioning was old, worn, but intact. The harness had dry rotted at the edges. Her fingers hovered over the control panel rows of tactile switches, each labeled in military shorthand. This wasn't just a cockpit. It was a command terminal. She tapped a screen labeled Sys Check. It blinked once. Core. Dormant. Standby mode. Hydraulics. Non-responsive. Primary reactor. Failsafe lock engaged. Audio. Active. Command link. Lost. Last ping. The 19th of July 1980. 1. That date, again. The 19th of July 1981. The day her grandfather logged his last entry. Claire leaned back, staring at the last line. The machine had been waiting since the day he sealed it. Not powered down, not deactivated, just waiting. She clicked into the audio system's archive. A single log remained uncorrupted, dated 07, 18.1, 981, 2341 Zulu. Sender. Jensen, R.K. Her throat tightened. She tapped play. A pause. Then her grandfather's voice, weathered but clear. If this ever gets opened, that means the motel failed, or someone finally figured out what we buried. Either way, if you're hearing this, listen close. Do not activate the sequence. Not unless it's already too late. Goliath was built for a war that never happened, a war we shouldn't want to happen. But if the override's been triggered, a breath, shaky, then God help us, because she won't stop once she wakes up. The audio clicked off. The loop resumed. Manual override required. Claire stared at the console, Jensen's key still resting in her hand. Someone had built a giant, and someone else had begged it never be woken. Claire didn't sleep that night. She couldn't. After shutting the cockpit and sealing Goliath's chamber behind her, she retraced her steps through the maze of tunnels. Every corridor felt different now, not just forgotten, but watched. As if the air itself was remembering what she'd seen, what she'd heard. Her grandfather's voice still rang in her ears. God help us. She won't stop once she wakes up. By the time she reached the surface, dawn was bleeding across the treetops. The motel looked just as abandoned as before, but the hatch remained open like the earth had exhaled and couldn't take the breath back. She sat on the tailgate of her truck, trying to piece it all together. A buried Cold War facility, a prototype mech. Her grandfather's signature on schematics he'd never spoken about. And a warning locked in a time loop, waiting for someone like her to stumble in. But she hadn't just stumbled in, had she? The realization hit like a wrench to the gut. This wasn't chance. She'd been driving this route because of a part delivery one redirected last minute from a supplier she didn't even use anymore. The email had seemed routine. The client? Vague. No name, just a drop-off location. She opened her phone and checked the request again. Nothing. The message was gone. That's when she felt it, the tiniest shift in the air, like breath behind her neck. Claire turned sharply. Across the lot, standing in the shade of a dead vending machine, was a man. Mid-60 seconds, maybe older. Weathered, thin frame under a canvas coat. He wore a faded veteran's cap and leaned on a cane that looked military-issued. His posture was still, watchful. Claire's instincts lit up. "You're a little late for check-in," she called across the lot. The man didn't smile, didn't move. "You opened it," he said quietly. Claire stood. "How do you know that?" The man stepped into the light. One of his boots scraped oddly, dragging ever so slightly. A limp. He nodded once toward the hatch. "They sent me here in '84 to weld it shut. Said it was too dangerous to demolish, too secret to move. So we buried it. Let the weeds do the rest." Claire narrowed her eyes. "Who's they?" He looked at her for a long moment. Then, same people who stopped asking questions after 1980. 1. Same people who figured if no one came knocking for 40 years, no one ever would. But you came back, she said. I didn't come back, he replied. I never left. Been watching this place from the woods for half my life, making sure nobody touched it. Until you. Claire's throat tightened. Why me? He didn't answer. Just stepped forward, dropped a small metal cylinder onto her truck bed, a fuse core, marked GOLIATH, aux power, and turned to leave. His parting words floated back like smoke. Tell Jensen's girl not to make the same mistake we did. And then he was gone. Claire didn't chase the man. There was something final in the way he walked, like someone who'd made peace with ghosts too heavy to carry. She stared at the fuse core in her hand, its stamped letters faded but unmistakable. GOLIATH, aux power. It felt heavier than its size should allow. Not because of weight, because of meaning. He'd known her grandfather, and somehow, he knew her too. By noon, she was packed. No more questions. No more waiting. She loaded her flashlight, rope, respirator, water, and 3 days' worth of protein bars into her pack. Then, almost as an afterthought, she reached for the key her grandfather left behind, the one still on its chain, warm from where it had hung around her neck all morning. She climbed back down the hatch. This time, the tunnels didn't feel abandoned. They felt expectant. Lights clicked on before she reached them. Fans in the walls turned lazily, like lungs waking from sleep. Her boots no longer echoed as sharply. The silence had softened, not quite welcoming, but no longer resisting her. Claire moved fast, past the control room, past the sealed living quarters, past the auxiliary comms wing where an old speaker still crackled with looping fragments of a training broadcast from 1977. She reached the chamber in Sector 09 again, and this time, it felt different. Less like a tomb, more like a machine waiting for an operator. GOLIATH loomed in the same stillness, but the air around it had changed. Claire could feel a subtle pull, like standing near a power transformer, where energy hums through the bones. She climbed the scaffolding with practiced hands and slid back into the cockpit. The system was still running on emergency reserve displays, flickering, gauges frozen. But when she inserted the fuse core into the port beneath the command panel and twisted it into place, the cabin shifted. Monitors flickered to full brightness. Gauges swept across their arcs and reset. A startup tone deep, mechanical, and somehow sad pulsed through the cockpit. And then the screens filled with data streams, system checks, old HUD overlays, and a new message. Auxiliary reactor online. Manual override. Accepted. Pilot. Jensen. Claire. Restart sequence. Standby mode. Claire's heart thudded. She hadn't entered her name. Whatever ran this system had recognized her. Through the key, through the DNA embedded in old protocol, or maybe through something else entirely. She reached for the controls, but stopped short. Her grandfather's voice echoed in her head again. Don't activate it, unless it's already too late. She looked out the cockpit's narrow viewport at the silent hangar. Pipes wept, condensation. Lights pulsed, gently. GOLIATH's limbs were still locked, but not lifeless. If she turned this thing on, there might be no turning back, but part of her already knew the truth. This machine had been waiting for her, and it wasn't asleep anymore. Claire followed the schematic map deeper into the facility, the path winding below even the GOLIATH chamber. The auxiliary reactor fuse had unlocked more than cockpit controls. It had released mechanical seals buried beneath Sector 09. She heard them, faint, grinding noises, echoing through the walls, like gears that hadn't moved in a generation stretching their legs. She passed through a set of blast doors, their edges scorched with age, and emerged into a smaller, pressurized corridor. The air here felt different, dry, sharp, like it had been filtered one too many times. Lights flickered overhead in a steady rhythm. Every few steps, the floor vibrated ever so slightly beneath her boots. She was close. At the end of the hall, a security checkpoint stood sealed behind tempered glass. Old keycard slots blinked uselessly beside a dust-covered terminal. But above it, a small red bulb glowed faintly, indicating the power was still on, not backup, but something deeper. Sustained. Claire crouched beside the access panel and popped the casing open. Inside, she found what she hoped for: manual override pins. With the right jumper wire in a firm hand, she bypassed the reader and triggered the emergency unlock. The glass doors hissed and parted an inch. She shoved them the rest of the way open and stepped inside. The core chamber was circular, the walls lined with ribbed insulation and copper tubing that ran like veins up to the ceiling. At the center stood a containment unit the size of a shipping container, suspended by hydraulic arms bolted into the reinforced floor. The reactor, still active. The glow wasn't dramatic. No sci-fi blue, no comic book pulse, just a low, steady warmth that seemed to vibrate through her sternum. Claire approached slowly, her flashlight off now, letting the soft hum guide her. A control pedestal sat near the reactor's perimeter. She wiped dust off the surface and read the etched plaque. Modular Power Core, Class IV. Installed July 16, 1981. Final auth. R. K. Jensen. Her breath caught. Again, her grandfather. He hadn't just worked here. He installed the very core that was now keeping this whole facility alive in silence. She tapped the screen. It blinked to life with minimal delay. Core temp. Nominal. Power draw. Minimal. Last access. Unknown. And below that, one last prompt. Transfer power to primary systems? Claire hesitated. This wasn't just about GOLIATH now. This would activate the entire base comms, data storage, maybe even weapons. The things they really didn't want to be found. She looked at the terminal, then back at the humming reactor. They'd sealed this place, buried it, let it rot, hoping the world would forget. But someone her grandfather had made sure it could be brought back. She pressed NO, for now. Not because she was afraid, but because she needed to know why it had been left waiting in the first place. The moment Claire stepped back into the hangar, she knew something had changed. The air was warmer, denser. The soft hum she'd first felt in the cockpit was louder now, deeper, more rhythmic, like the beat of a mechanical heart starting to find its pace. Steam hissed quietly from vents in the ceiling. Overhead lights pulsed, syncing with the energy that now throbbed through the base's arteries. GOLIATH wasn't just powered, it was awake. Claire climbed the scaffolding and slipped into the cockpit once more. The displays flared to life before she even touched a button, illuminating her face in soft green and amber. The system knew her now. Name, access level, biological markers scanned through the harness pad. Her presence wasn't a breach, it was authorization. Primary systems active. Reactor link. Stable. Motion lock. Standby. Waiting for pilot command. She placed her hands on the controls. The yokes were hydraulic linked, stiff but sensitive one for each arm, foot pedals for rotation, and an array of toggles that handled everything from limb positioning to auxiliary functions. It felt more like a hybrid of military drone and mech suit than anything she'd seen in her life. Not crude, not sci-fi, real. She tapped into the archive logs. Only fragments remained: corrupted files, half-erased schematics, and a few clipped video entries. But one had survived. Video log. Final mobility test. The 16th of July, 1980. 1. Operator R.K. Jensen. She hit play. The grainy screen blinked to life. Her grandfather appeared, younger than she'd ever seen him, hair darker, jaw sharp, eyes hollowed from exhaustion. He stood in the same cockpit she now sat in, wires trailing from his suit, sweat staining the collar of his jumpsuit. Mobility test begins in 5. Hydraulics primed, reactor pulse holding steady. We've got one shot at this. He glanced at someone off screen. If this doesn't work, seal it and bury the key. He looked back into the camera. To whoever finds this, God willing, you never do. The screen cut to black. Claire leaned back, swallowing hard. That wasn't a test pilot. That was a man on the edge of abandoning everything he'd built. But why? She gripped the controls. The panels lit up in sequence. Actuators. Online. Synchronization. Calibrated. Motion lock. Disengaged. GOLIATH breathed. Not literally, but something shifted in the machine's posture. Its arms loosened. Shoulders flexed with a groan of hydraulic pressure. Claire's seat vibrated under her. She pressed gently on the foot pedals, and the mech tilted forward half an inch. Stabilizers auto-corrected. The machine was standing under its own power. She wasn't piloting a relic. She was sitting in a fully functional war machine built for terrain no soldier could survive. And it wasn't dead. It had never died. It had been waiting for her hands, her name, her bloodline, to bring it back. And now, it was listening. The cockpit lights dimmed slightly as Claire navigated the control interface. The screens rearranged, forming a new set of options, deeper systems, the kind of settings meant for operators trusted with the final sequences. One file in particular blinked at the bottom of the HUD. Operational checklist. Final config. R. K. Jensen. Locked. She tapped it. A 4-digit PIN request appeared. Claire paused. 4 digits. She stared at it for a long time, thinking not like an engineer, but like a granddaughter. Birthday? Anniversary? She tried the year her grandfather left the military. 1974. Access denied. She sighed. Then thought of the one number he'd etched on every tool in his garage, stitched into the back of a denim work shirt she still kept in a box. 1963. Access granted. The screen changed. Rows of text scrolled up. A maintenance checklist hand-coded decades ago. Diagnostics, safety checks, pilot sync protocol. A full walkthrough of powering up a machine no one was supposed to touch again. But at the bottom, past the mechanical steps, was something different. A chain code, a scrambled key file made of letters and numbers too long to memorize. But Claire recognized the shape of it. It was genetic. Chain code sync. Jensen lineage. Verified. She sat back, stunned. GOLIATH wasn't just protected by physical locks or passwords. It had been hardwired to respond to family. Her grandfather had designed the machine to remain dormant unless someone from his bloodline entered the cockpit and passed the biometric failsafe. He hadn't just walked away. He'd buried it with the hope that only one person, the right person, might someday bring it back. She opened another log embedded within the checklist. It wasn't a file this time. It was a letter, written in blocky typeface. Simple. Direct. If you're reading this, then it means either the world didn't end, or someone's trying to start it again. If you're kin, I'm sorry I left you questions. There are things I couldn't say above ground. Not to your mother. Not to anyone. This machine, GOLIATH, was a mistake we were proud of until we weren't. It was meant to protect. Then someone tried to weaponize it. That's when I walked. That's when I sealed it. But if you're here, and you've come this far, maybe you're the only one who can decide what happens next. You don't have to finish this. You don't have to wake her fully. But if you do, know what it means. This isn't about war. It's about memory, legacy, and what we leave behind that still listens after we're gone. Claire sat in silence. She touched the console softly, reverently, as if it were a living thing. Her grandfather hadn't left her instructions. He'd left her a choice. Claire's fingers hovered over the console. The choice her grandfather had left her wasn't just about activation. It was about intention. GOLIATH wasn't a machine designed to follow orders blindly. It was built to interpret, to react, to evolve under the hands of a pilot with a reason to guide it. And now, it had her name. She took a deep breath, then keyed in the command. Primary startup. Initiate. The cockpit vibrated as GOLIATH's systems surged. Lights shifted from soft amber to sharp white. One by one, circuits engaged, hydraulics pressurized, gyros calibrated. and the massive frame of the mech flexed forward with a deep groan of steel and memory. The HUD lit up across her vision. Full system sync complete. Operator Claire Jensen. Verified. Motion locks. Disengaged. Mobility. Online. Weapons. Safety mode enabled. Reactor core. Stable. 82% efficiency. She pressed lightly on the foot pedals. GOLIATH responded. A soft, deliberate step forward. Metal rang out through the hangar, echoing like thunder inside a tomb. Claire gritted her teeth, bracing as the mech stabilizers adjusted. The second step was smoother, and the third? Almost graceful. From the outside, it would have looked like a myth in motion, a forgotten god rising from the dirt, walking for the first time in 4 decades. Inside, Claire could feel the strain in every servo, the tension in every joint. This wasn't a machine anymore. It was a beast learning how to move again. She brought it to a stop in the center of the chamber. GOLIATH stood at full height, now nearly 20 feet tall, a skeletal titan armored in Cold War steel and secrets. Its arms flexed slowly, fingers uncurling with the sound of snapping cables and magnetized plates. The forward camera engaged, casting a real-time projection onto her screen. The resolution wasn't clean, but it was clear enough to see the old control room on the far side of the hangar, and something else. Movement. Claire zoomed in, just past the blast door, in the shadows where the corridor curved. A shape shifted, then stilled. Someone was watching. She keyed the exterior speaker, and said the only thing she could think of. Identify yourself. Silence. Then, over the cockpit's comms, a voice crackled to life low, tired, familiar. Jensen? You really woke her up? It was the old man from the motel lot, the one who left the fuse. He'd never really left, had he? Claire's pulse quickened. You knew what she was. You knew what this meant. A pause. Then, I did. But knowing and believing, those are different things. You brought her back, which means it's your call now. Claire stared at the HUD, the override code still active, her hands trembling slightly on the controls. The world hadn't ended. But maybe, somewhere, something had just started. GOLIATH stood motionless in the center of the hangar, fully awake now, but waiting. Claire's hands rested lightly on the controls, her breath steady but shallow. Every screen around her displayed a version of the same truth. Systems online, pilot present, awaiting purpose. The voice on the comms remained silent. The old man had retreated again into the shadows, or the silence. Maybe his role was done. Maybe he just needed to see that someone could carry what he and her grandfather had buried. Maybe watching GOLIATH stand again was more than he could bear. Claire slowly powered down the motion systems, letting the reactor settle into idle. The hum softened, the limbs relaxed, and for the first time in hours, the mech no longer felt like a threat, it felt like a monument. She unbuckled the harness and climbed down from the cockpit. The metal beneath her boots was warm, alive. As she descended the scaffold, the chamber seemed to echo not just with sound, but with meaning. Her grandfather's notes, his voice logs, the genetic chain code, it wasn't just engineering, it was a message. A relay passed through time and blood. She walked to the console beneath the reactor and opened the diagnostics one last time. The numbers were steady, stable. GOLIATH could remain in standby indefinitely, waiting for its next operator. Or it could be sealed again. Claire paused. She thought about what her grandfather had written not to wake the machine, unless it was already too late. But he hadn't seen the world as it was now. He hadn't known that the threats weren't just nuclear, or foreign, or cold and calculated. Sometimes they were quieter, slower, corruption, disinformation, collapse not from missiles but from rot. She didn't know if GOLIATH had a place in this new world, but maybe the idea of it did. She returned to the surface before sunset. The motel looked the same, still sagging, still forgotten. But to her, it wasn't broken anymore. It was a vault, a gatekeeper. And now, a grave marker for a secret too big to lose, and too important to misuse. Claire stood beside her truck for a long while, the wind rustling the treetops. In her hand, she held the key, her grandfather's key, still warm from the cockpit. She didn't throw it away. She didn't drive off. Instead, she walked back to the hatch and, one by one, closed every seal, locked the wheel, pressed her hand against the warm metal, then turned and left it buried once again. Not hidden, not erased, watched. Back home, Claire opened her notebook and flipped to a blank page. At the top, she wrote 3 words: Project, Inheritance Protocol, and beneath that, legacy isn't what you leave behind. It's what you trust someone else to carry. She didn't have all the answers. Not yet. But she had the blueprints. She had the code. She had GOLIATH. And now, she had a purpose.